Guillermo del Toro's Nightmare Alley was released on the same day as Spider-Man No Way Home, so not nearly enough people saw it. Don't ever release your film on the same day as a Spider-Man or a Batman movie, because it will be completely overshadowed. I saw this in the theater and there were about 5 people in there, including me. Granted, it had been out for a few weeks at that point, but still, Nightmare Alley cost $60 million and only made $38 million back at the box office. Not enough to recoup marketing costs, which is a shame because it's a very well-made film. Like Spider-Man, it has a great Willem Dafoe performance in it. And, like Del Toro's The Shape of Water, Nightmare Alley is a period piece, though the horror and fantasy elements are even more minimal here. The world of the film does carry a touch of the surreal. For example, the carnival in the first act of the film seems to exist in a dream world where smoke constantly pours out from the ground. Nightmare Alley is a remake of a 1947 noir flick of the same name, about a manipulative and sociopathic carnival grifter whose ambitions for wealth and status lead him down a dark and twisted path. The screenplay is written by Del Toro and co-written by Kim Morgan, who doesn't seem to have any major film writing credits. The cinematographer Dan Lawson has worked with Del Toro before on Mimic, Crimson Peak, and the award-winning The Shape of Water. He also shot John Wick Chapters 2, 3, and 4, with Chapter 4 currently in post-production. He did shoot The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and the 2006 Silent Hill movie, but we won't hold that against him. The camera expertly weaves in and out of scenes with slow and precise movements. The editing gives the scenes time to breathe, as conventional action in the movie is minimal. It's a dark and brooding look into an empty shell of a man who tells lies for a living, and the shallow nature of his existence. The first hour of the film introduces the audience to Stan, a drifter who wanders into a carnival and finds a job there. This was honestly my favorite part of the film, and in Act 2, when Stan leaves the carnival for the city, I was a little disappointed, as I could have watched a whole film about these initial characters. In the background, there's a Django Reinhardt-esque dude frequently playing his guitar. I just really enjoyed hanging out in this setting. This is based on a book though, so I understand that the plot has to move along. The second act, where Stan and Molly move to the city to scam high society, had a pacing that dragged at times, though the conclusion was fittingly disturbing. The superiority complex of the grifter is explored, as Stan needs to feel as though he's pulling one over on someone in order to mask his own insecurity. Themes about alcoholism and addiction are interwoven into the story.
How is it?
Awful. But I wish I had a barrel of it.
Stan's mentor Pete is suffering from late-stage alcoholism, as Stan himself refuses to drink. Stan's past is somewhat unclear. He's seen burying his father and burning the house down in the opening, leading us to believe that Stan is running from a demon inside of himself that he refuses to face. The flashback scenes of Stan's past were not in the original, and I think they helped to flesh out his character more. Stan picks up the art of cold reading from Pete and becomes a mentalist at the carnival, an act where a grifter pretends to know intimate details about a person through a series of vague questions that could hold true for almost anyone. Stan eventually takes the act as far as claiming to have a link to the dead relatives of the Mark in order to extort more money out of them. Pete warns him that this emotional ploy will ultimately backfire. The third act is heavily telegraphed by scenes from the first act, and even though the ending was predictable, it was still fitting. This film has great casting. Rooney Mara plays the love interest in the film, Molly. Ron Perlman is the strongman at the circus, Bruno. David Stratham plays the alcoholic mentalist, Pete. And Toni Collette is his wife, Xena, while Cate Blanchett is a mysterious psychologist who doesn't appear until a little bit later. In fact, let's get into spoilers to talk about all these characters. If you haven't seen the movie, then I recommend it highly, but we're moving on. When I saw that Del Toro's new film was a remake of an old noir flick, I thought it might run the risk of being less visually interesting, but Del Toro manages to infuse Nightmare Alley with some expressionistic and surrealistic touches. Stan falls asleep by a fire, and we cut to a shot of him in the home he burnt down. Stan approaches a lone rabbit in the hallway after meeting Cate Blanchett's femme fatale character. The rabbit makes sense in the context of the plot, because it signifies that the characters from the carnival are visiting Stan and Molly, but the rabbit appears also as a dark omen. The rabbit appeared under the stage for Pete and Zena's mentalism act before Pete died because Stan gave him wood alcohol to drink.
Red box, wood alcohol. Good for pickling, bad for drinking, poison.
Later, the film is dominated by snowfall as Stan follows his path downward. Stan is a real ladder climber, only worried about his own interest, but as his rise to the top is built on nothing of substance, his fall comes swiftly. The very first scene in the original Nightmare Alley is Stan watching the carnival geek bite the head off of a chicken. Although, in 1947, you couldn't show that on screen. When Del Toro showed a man biting a chicken's head off in the first act of the film, I thought to myself, I think I'm gonna like this movie. Not that I'd ever want to see that in real life like the rubes in the film. It's animal abuse and a human rights violation. But in a fictional story, it's a shocking use of gore that hits you up front with the cruelty that the story is about to unmask. Defoe's character Clem, the sleazy carnival operator, explains that in order to get a man to bite a chicken's head off, you just have to take a drunk and spike their alcohol with opium until they're an unknowing opiate addict, and then you have control over them. The whole idea behind this is very disturbing, and it reminds me in a way of Purdue Pharma intentionally getting people strung out on Oxycontin because of how big the dollar signs were. I will make a minor criticism of this one edit where I think they should have lingered on Willem Dafoe's creepy smile just a little bit longer.
Toe the line, don't fuck with me. That's the lesson.
It's a pretty close remake in terms of story, though the original was in black and white, so it's a much different experience when it comes to lighting and cinematography. The acting style of the original is very much old Hollywood, where everything feels very scripted, more theatrical than naturalistic. Del Toro's version pays tribute to the roots of old Hollywood. As a director, his films tend to exist less in the realm of realism. He's essentially a director of horror and fantasy, even in a dramatic thriller like Nightmare Alley. Toni Collette's character Zena is a tarot reader, and though her and her husband use mentalism to trick people for money, they also hold a reverence for the process, that the divinations of the tarot should be taken seriously. Stan, on the other hand, has no moral compass. He's only interested in feeling superior to others by fooling them. Cate Blanchett's character Lilith is the archetypal, icy blonde femme fatale of the film noir genre. Her and Stan team up to extort money out of her wealthy clients because she has all their secrets stored in the form of audio recordings of their sessions. Stan now has access to the details of an incredibly wealthy man's past and will use it to trail him along. There's a scene later on where Stan is hooked up to a lie detector by the wealthy client who's skeptic, as he should be, of Stan's ability to communicate with the dead.
They want me to acknowledge Pete or Peter.
Yes, my Peter!
He passes this test, but when the client wants to see his dead loved one, Stan asks Molly to assist him in a staging of a scene. Of course, the client at this point realizes it's all a long con, and Stan's reaction is to beat the man's face into a bloody pulp. For all of his silver-tongued manipulation, Stan is at his core a primal beast, purely interested in survival. The downfall and the eventual betrayal by Lilith is all a little predictable, but it does give Del Toro the chance to use some gore and makes for an exciting third act. In the end, Stan is forced back onto the run and ends up returning to the carnival life. When I saw this happening, I immediately knew what the ending was going to be. The new owner was going to go through the process explained in detail by Dafoe earlier in the film to turn Stan into the new geek. As once Stan had consumed alcohol with the femme fatale character, he was already on the road to destruction. The Late Show had Bradley Cooper on to talk about the film, and the clip they showed in its entirety was the very last scene in the film. It was sort of baffling that they would use the film's ending in order to promote the movie. We're in the spoiler section of the video, so I feel comfortable in talking about the ending and how I thought it worked, even though it was foreshadowed pretty significantly. But I would have used a different clip to promote the film, probably a clip from Act 1. In the opening of the film, Stan trades a radio for $5 and a meal at the carnival, and eventually ends up getting a job there. The radio is the only item he takes from his home after burning it down, symbolizing his last bit of humanity, the man he was before he allowed his father to die. Now the owner of the carnival owns the radio, and in a symbolic way, he also owns Stan. The new owner also has Willem Dafoe's prized fetus in a jar on display, further highlighting the cruelty and exploitation of the carnival industry, even reflecting back to the broader entertainment industry. The ending of the original film adds a tacked-on happy ending where Stan accepts the job of being the geek, but after one day tries to escape, where he is reunited with Molly, who has come back to work at the carnival after their separation. I much prefer Del Toro's ending, where the film ends with Stan accepting the job, leaving the audience to assume he will end up exactly like the geek we saw at the beginning of the film, filthy, strung out on drugs, and locked up in a cage. Stan is a shallow, narcissistic opportunist. He actually doesn't have very many redeeming qualities. When he first shows up at the carnival, he sleeps with his mentor's wife, all the while eyeing Molly, who is protected by Ron Perlman's strongman character. After he leaves the carnival with Molly, he cheats on her with Lilith. After convincing a pair of grieving parents that their child is waiting for them in the afterlife, the wife, played by Mary Steenburgen, kills her husband, then herself. Stan only brings misery everywhere he goes. Nightmare Alley feels a little constrained by its genre, though it provides an excellent modern-day version of the original film, with masterful imagery. I like the way it blurred a period piece with a psychological fantasy in its production design. The setting of the carnival, with its tricks and illusions, is like a hall of mirrors reflecting back on filmmaking itself. I found a captivating character analysis with the central idea of a protagonist who tells lies for a living, and how the emptiness of his success eats him away inside until he succumbs to addiction and despair. If I wanted to sum up Nightmare Alley in one spoiler-filled sentence, it would be: a con man becomes an alcoholic and bites the head off of a chicken. Presumably. I'm going with an 8 out of 10, and I would even go as far to say that I actually prefer this one over the original because it tells the same story, but has the advantage of being more visually magnificent. When Del Toro needs to show violence in a scene, he doesn't pull any punches. Nightmare Alley was up for several major Academy Awards, though I'm filming this while the Oscars are taking place, so I don't know if it's won any of them yet. It probably didn't. I'm not watching because last year's Oscars was one of the worst I've ever seen. They didn't even use film clips for most of the movies, and the forced humor and interactions with celebrities were, as usual, groan-inducing.
5 minutes later.
I want to be a vessel for love.
Oh, wow!